To hit record. Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to have you all. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Hedy Lawman. I'm the Senior Managing Editor and Program Director of the Journal on Education in Emergencies, or JEiE. We're really thrilled that you've joined us today to launch our general issue on education in emergencies. And this event provides a preview, just a brief preview of the exciting content that's featured in the issue. We'll hear brief presentations from our authors representing almost all of the research articles and field notes featured in the publication. And please visit the journal website and read their terrific articles. You can find the links in the chat. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our editor-in-chief, Dr. Dana Birdie. Dana Birdie is Associate Professor and Director of International Education at NYU's Department of Applied Statistics, Social Science and Humanities, and Associated Faculty at NYU's Politics Department, as well as at the Center for Practice and Research at the intersection of information, society, and methodology. Her research focuses on education and political violence and has been funded by a number of domestic and international funders. Her book, Schools for Conflict or for Peace in Afghanistan, won the 2017 Grawemeyer Award for Ideas Improving World Order. And over to you, Dana.
Thank you so much, Hedy, and welcome everybody. We're thrilled to have you with us today. It's very exciting to introduce this general issue for the Journal on Education Emergencies. This is our official launch. This is volume 8, number 1. I'm going to briefly introduce a representative from our parent organization and publisher and partner, the Interagency Network for Education Emergencies. But first, I'd like to tell you a little bit about our work at the Journal. Many of you here, of course, know about the Journal on Education Emergencies, but what you may not realize is that we maintain an entirely open access model of publication, while at the same time adhering to rigorous academic standards. Excuse me. This means that the contents of the journal are accessible for free to all readers everywhere. And we do not charge fees for authors. We do not limit access only to those authors who have the resources to raise funds to pay for their fees. Thus, we maintain a truly open access model of publishing and promoting equity in the field. Excuse me. We are very pleased to present the spring issue of the INE NYU Journal on Education Emergencies, which offers a first-hand view into a broad range of the multiple dilemmas facing those who work on education emergencies. In keeping with our priorities, this issue provides actionable data for policymakers who are hoping to improve the learning outcomes of children living in emergency contexts. The rigorous research and cutting-edge field notes contained in this issue also continue our efforts to support equity and social justice through the production of knowledge and dissemination of evidence for the field. JEiE offers crucial observation and explanatory data from practitioners, researchers, and policymakers, and from research teams comprising all three who partnered in writing their articles. So we have people who are actually implementing the programs in the field that they're working on, producing hunches about what works and what doesn't work, and then policymakers and researchers collaborating to study those hunches. These team members who seek to gain a more comprehensive understanding of various practical questions approach their subjects with methodological rigor that breaks common boundaries between research and practice. We also publish theoretical pieces that provide basic research to move forward to understand general models of programming and practice in education emergencies and beyond. In this issue, authors from 5 continents present evidence that cuts across an array of geographic settings and populations, including the Middle East, South America, South Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. Our research articles focus on, for example, number 1, the effects of conflict on education. Number 2, compelling insights into interventions for conflict-affected learners. Number 3, problems inherent in the structure and organization of education emergencies programs and research across the globe. Our 2 field notes describe key elements of innovative education emergencies interventions, in this case in Nigeria and Afghanistan, respectively. Before we give the floor to our speakers, I'd like to briefly thank our journal staff who are just fabulous team, and we're so lucky to be all together working with them and working all together. Samantha Colon, Emily Dunlap, Joelle Sotomayor, Nathan Thompson, and our senior managing editor and program director, Hedy Lahman, without whom I can assure you we wouldn't be here today. I'm very pleased now to introduce Sonia Anderson from INEE. Sonia is the INEE Data and Evidence Coordinator responsible for INEE's work on curating and strengthening the education emergencies evidence base, including the various data and evidence work streams within INEE. Many of you may know her from her work managing the E-Cubed Research Fund. Sonia received her MED from Harvard, from the Harvard Graduate School of Education in International Education and Policy, and holds a BA in International Relations and Middle Eastern Politics from the University of San Francisco. Sonia, I'm so happy to welcome you with us today. Thank you so much for joining us. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Dana. It's really a pleasure to be here. I just want to share a short welcome on behalf of INEE. INEE, alongside NYU, has the pleasure of working with the journal team to support the curation and dissemination of the journal. Of course, hopefully you have all accessed many journal issues, including this most recent issue, which is housed on the INEE website. And we also have the honor of working alongside the JEiE team to support the strategic growth of the journal. We really see the journal as a key pillar of INEE's evidence strengthening work. It's central to our strategic priority 3, which is around the provision, curation, and dissemination of knowledge to inform policy and practice. And we see it as crucial to our efforts to serve as a hub of knowledge and evidence, where EIE evidence can be collected, curated, and amplified for policymakers and practitioners. Furthermore, the journal contributes to the professionalization of the EA sector as the first and only academic peer-reviewed journal. So in addition to Dana's introduction, we really want to highlight this point and thank the journal team for continuing their efforts around this area. To the journal for soliciting, identifying, and curating cutting-edge knowledge, and then disseminating it, of course, as a global public good. We're thrilled to see this issue of the journal, this general publication, come out, and we want to again thank the journal team for all of their efforts to produce this issue, and thank the authors as well for their critical contributions to the EA evidence base. And I'm not going to take any more time than that, because we want to really spend this time hearing from the authors of the submissions in this general issue, but thanks again for being with us here today.
Thanks so much, Sonia. So before we turn it over to our presenters, I'm going to briefly introduce the panelists that we'll hear from. So panelists, when you hear your name, if you wouldn't mind turning on your video so everyone can see you for a moment, that would be terrific. And then we'll populate the titles of your articles as I'm briefly introducing you in the chat. So first we'll hear from Stephanie Zuilkowski. She is the Associate Director of Learning Systems Institute and an Associate Professor at Florida State University. She is currently located in Florida, US. Thanks, Stephanie. We'll hear from Ms. Grace Anyaegbu, a Statistics Advisor at UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, or FCDO, currently located in the UK. We'll hear from Ms. Jasmine Turner, a researcher at War Child Holland, currently in the Netherlands. We'll hear from Ms. Kathryn Moore, an early childhood education and development specialist, currently located in New Jersey, US. Dr. Mike Lopez Cardozo was unable to join us today, but you can find her presentation linked in the chat to view at your leisure. She's a senior lecturer for Amsterdam Institute of Social Science Research at the University of Amsterdam. We will hear from Mr. Daniel Shepard, a PhD candidate at Columbia University, currently located in Amman, Jordan, and Paris, France. We'll hear from Ms. Maryam Jalani, an international education consultant, currently located in the Philippines. We'll hear from Susan Ayari, the Program Area Director for Creative Associates International, currently located in Virginia, US. And then we'll hear from Dr. Augustino Ting Mayai, the acting managing director at Sud Institute, currently located in South Sudan, although I think he might actually just be in the airport in Kenya. Hi, August. So we have a very full schedule this morning, and a reminder to our panelists that we will ask you to keep your presentations to just 3 minutes, and that our terrific technical editor, Joao, if you wouldn't mind showing your face again, will be keeping time for us. So when you see Joao's camera turn on, you'll know that you have about 20 seconds to wrap up your presentation. So with that, I will turn it over to our first panelist, Dr. Stephanie Zuilkowski. Over to you.
Hey, thank you. Hello, my name is Stephanie Zuilkowski, and I'm happy to be with you today to present an article that I co-authored with Dr. Maria Paulina Arango Fernandez. Our research question was, how does technical and vocational education, TVET, contribute to ex-combatant social reintegration? These programs are often part of rehabilitation and reintegration programs because it's argued first that they can help reduce inequalities in educational access that could be root causes of the conflict. Second, that having a legal livelihood will reduce ex-combatants' incentive to re-engage in violence and crime. And third, that ex-combatants will interact with different social groups in their educational institutions, and this contact will help to build trust. However, there's not much rigorous evidence to support these assumptions, particularly from Latin America. Our study examines this process in Colombia. Colombia's civil war is the longest running armed conflict in the Western Hemisphere. It's lasted over 50 years. This in-depth qualitative interview study involved 20 Colombian ex-combatants, 12 women and 8 men, who were between 18 and 35 years old. Participants had been involved with guerrilla groups such as FARC and ELN, as well as paramilitary groups, and were now living in Medellin and engaging in the government's formal reintegration processes. 4 of them were in long-term TVET programs that lasted about a year, and 16 were in short-term programs that were entrepreneurship education with a microcredit scheme attached. Next slide, please. Can we advance to the next slide? Thank you. So overall, we found that TVET had some benefits. The participants felt that technical programs promoted psychosocial recovery, helped establish normalcy and routines in their lives, and helped them relate to others. There were differences according to the type of program that the participants selected. The long-term programs help participants to find employment and assume new identities. This is because they were mixed with non-combatant students in those courses, and they had to complete internships in the community, which growed their networks. The short-term entrepreneurship courses, on the other hand, reinforced isolation and segregation, particularly of women. And this is because those courses were only for ex-combatants. So in sum, we found that TVET did not build true social acceptance. Most of the ex-combatants lived in anonymity and isolation and tried to hide their pasts. So these results led us to 2 central recommendations. First, policymakers and program planners need to take the perspectives of ex-combatants into account, with particular focus on gender differences. Second, education programs for economic development should aim to develop social inclusion and promote cooperation between ex-combatants and communities. Individual level processes cannot on their own lead to social cohesion. This needs to be an explicit part of program design in order for it to be successful. Thank you so much for being here today, and we hope you'll read the article and be in touch if you have any questions or you'd like to discuss it further. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zuilkowski. Our next presenter is Grace Anyaegbu.
Thank you. So our research looked into how cognitive and psychosocial difficulties affect learning outcomes. It was a study of primary school students area. It was done with Caroline Carney, Holly Jane Howell, Ala Zahra, and Abdul Kader Mohammed. We analyzed administrative data from the Manahel program, which is a UK-funded program offering access to safe, inclusive, and quality education for primary age school children in grades 1 to 4 in Northwest Syria. The program has reached over 375,000 children to date and is estimated to reach 500 students when the program ends. Since Syria has been in a war since 2012, the program also works to ensure that the mental health and psychosocial needs of the children are taken care of in the schools. Next slide, please. Can we move to the next slide? Thanks. We analyzed administrative data from the mental health program, and we carried out the analysis at the midpoint of the program when we had learning outcome data and data on the children's functional difficulty available. Tools like the Washington Group Disability Questions developed by the United Nations and other statistical agencies have enabled us to collect information on functional difficulty in fragile and conflict-affected states like Syria. We feed mixed ordinal models to analyze the learning outcomes of children with and without a cognitive and psychosocial difficulty, and the results of our models are shown on the slides. We found that having a single cognitive or psychosocial difficulty, as defined by the Washington Group questions, was associated with poorer learning progress, and children with 2 or more cognitive or psychosocial difficulties were less likely to progress as far as those without any such difficulties. The program team were able to use the findings of the analysis to secure additional funding to provide mental health and psychosocial support in the intervention, as well as to lobby the United Nations and other donors providing assistance in Syria to support children's well-being and learning. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Grace. Our next presenter is Jasmine Turner.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. So I would like to present today about a proof of concept study that we did on Can't Wait to Learn, which is a digital game-based learning program. And here I'm talking about an evaluation that we did in Lebanon. It aimed to really look at the feasibility of implementing the program with a new target group, because until then it had only been used with children aged 7 to 9 who had never been to school in Sudan. And we also wanted to understand the lived experience of Can't Wait to Learn, what its perceived impact was, and identify really the implementation challenges to act on to expand its scale up. We included 390 children aged 10 to 14 who are out of school, meaning that they had been out of school for at least 2 years and weren't able to access the full education system. We included children from a range of implementing partners across all governorates of Lebanon. And we implemented for 1 cycle of basic literacy and numeracy, which is the official channel to channel children into formal education. And we looked at numeracy competency, self-esteem, psychological well-being, self-efficacy, and we conducted focus group discussions and key informant interviews. Next slide, please. So we found that Can't Wait to Learn was feasible to implement through a whole range of different partner organization types, that children had positive experience and increased motivation to learn and to attend school. We identified a number of challenges, and in particular, low attendance and high dropout were major challenges that we faced. However, despite that, we found that children's numeracy competency, psychological well-being and self-esteem all significantly increased. Based on this, we made recommendations to adopt a more blended learning approach, particularly for the facilitators, so like a more pedagogical aspect of their role. We suggested game design changes, specifically reducing repetition. And actually this research initiated the development of an approach specifically to increase children's attendance and to reduce dropout by engaging caregivers more in children's education. And we recommended to get certification for Can't Wait to Learn, particularly because a large reason for dropout were children returning to Syria. Just a quote to demonstrate the link between numeracy competency, or academic competency, and well-being. This was from a facilitator. She said, "I felt that my students who had something aggressive in their personalities changed after 2 weeks. They started to talk in the whole break about what they did in the game. I heard one of them telling the other, when you reach this level, I will help you. Don't be afraid. If you are making any mistake, I can help you as I understand it well. Thank you.
Thank you, Jasmine. Next, we will hear from Kathryn Moore.
Thank you. The early years are recognized as foundational for lifelong positive development. However, limited access to early childhood development and education emergencies globally prevails. We identified 3 root causes for this problem and applied a strategic problem-solving framework to address the root causes, which include low prioritization of ECD-EIE across sectors, lack of a systematic characterization of the ECD-EIE institutional and programmatic landscapes, and limited consensus on strategic advocacy for ECD-EIE. We used a mixed methods approach to answer these questions, launching a global stock-taking survey in 2020 at the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic in multiple languages. Over 118 respondents participated in the survey, representing governments, humanitarian organizations, academia, frontline ECD-EIE responders, and ECDE practitioners from a variety of organizations. During the same period, we conducted an expansive scoping review of the gray literature, screening over 460 documents and extracting data from 218 of these to inform our findings. Taken together, the findings from the survey and scoping review pointed to criteria used to prioritize ECD-EIE services and programs, as well as related challenges, opportunities, and emergent trends on the same. Next slide, please. Here, we highlight some of the key findings and implications. Based on our findings, these are the shifts needed we recommend to better prioritize ECD-EIE globally so children do not miss a critical window for development, no matter where they are and what they, their family, and community are facing. Infants, young children, and community leaders are invisible and left out of needs assessments. Simultaneously, parents and caregivers' attitudes and awareness on ECDE's importance is limited. Increasing caregivers of young children's participation is critical to upholding accountability to the affected population, particularly ensuring infants and young children and their caregivers' needs are adequately addressed in responses. Same with the ECD workforce. They're left out of the humanitarian response ecosystem. Enhancing ECD capacity of frontline responders and the ECD workforce both are important for ensuring ECD programs and services are included early on in response design, planning, and budgeting. Despite our findings flagging important emergent evidence, there is a lot we still don't know. For instance, ECD-EIE programmatic implementation and M&E information was limited and varied in scope and detail. More transparent and accessible information is critical to learn about results, scalability, and sustainability of ECD-EIE interventions. Perspectives on inclusive ECD-EIE and findings from the scoping review contrasted, flagging an important future area of inquiry. We do know that equity and inclusion needs to be at the forefront, that we need to shift to increasing and improving coordination and synergies for ECD-EIE within and across organizations and systems levels. ECD-EIE needs to be recognized as a funding area of choice in crisis responses. It's our hope that this research may provide a bird's eye view of the landscape to raise the alarm on the need to address the dire missed opportunity for ensuring all children have ECD-EIE access globe-wide. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathryn. And our next presenter is Daniel Shepard.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Daniel Shepard, and I'll be presenting our paper, The Use and Usefulness of Data for Education and Emergencies, on behalf of my co-authors, Elizabeth Buckner and M. Smiley. We often talk about the need for more data or better data to inform policies and programs in education and emergencies. But how do we use the data that we have, and what facilitates or hinders effective use? Through 48 semi-structured interviews with EIE experts and practitioners from a variety of contexts, this study sought to address exactly that, how EIE data are used and what facilitates their usefulness. We developed a data use framework organized under 2 families of headings that emerged from the data. First, operational data use. This included project planning, coordination, monitoring, and evaluation. The second, strategic use, included using data to inform policymaking and advocacy efforts. Next slide, please. To highlight some headline findings, we find that data use differs more based on the proximity of the respondent to the EIE context than whether or not their work or their organization was classified as humanitarian or development, a la the humanitarian development nexus discussions. Local and national actors focused more on generating and using data for operations, while regional or global actors focused more on strategic data uses. Meanwhile, there were three key factors that emerged that affect data use. First was the political concerns, both of organizations and governments, and how that affects data availability, data quality, and data use. Second was that generating, sharing, and using data are facilitated by personal and institutional relationships, which can be reinforced or weakened by existing institutions and structures. Third, when folks talked about capacity needs or capacity strengthening, this was often framed more in terms of institutional capacity, such as hiring or expanding staff, than of building individual skills, for example, through a workshop. The characteristics that made data more or less useful varied by the type of user, the type of use under this framework, and the factors noted above. Finally, I'd like to highlight one key takeaway, which is for us all to think about how we might better structure operational data so that it can also inform more strategic long-term uses, of course, through some sort of additional repackaging or reanalysis, so that we're not generating more data to address each of the individual uses, but reusing data effectively and efficiently. Finally, in closing, we need to consider that EIE data use is as important, and in some cases more important than data generation, and to avoid the assumption that all data is neutral or positive. Thank you very much, and I encourage you to read the full paper.
Thank you so much, Daniel. And our next presenter is Maryam Jalani.
Hi. Thank you so much to everyone for joining and sticking around the latter half of the presentation of the webinar. I'm very pleased to present this field note on community-led provision on non-formal education for displaced learners in northern Nigeria. The field note highlights a community mobilization model that was led by Creative Associates and its partners under the Nigeria Education Crisis Response Program that was funded by USAID. I want to start by highlighting 4 things of why I think that this model holds a lot of promise for the education and emergency field. Firstly, it's well established that we can't overemphasize the importance of continuing education during emergencies. I think we've seen the benefits of its impacts on mitigating the long-term impacts on development in a country, as well as, of course, providing affected learners with a modicum of stability and normalcy. Secondly, I want to emphasize that while there's the importance of closely looking at approaches towards providing education for internally displaced learners. While a lot of attention is given to refugee learners, the biggest group of learners that lack access to formal education during conflicts are in fact IDPs. Thirdly, I think there's ample evidence supporting community-based interventions, ample evidence for the positive impact of community-based interventions in conflict and crisis-affected conflicts. And again, there's a lot of details given in the paper, but in terms of improving learning gains, improving teacher accountability, attendance, and of course, community financing for education. Lastly, Northern Nigeria is, I think just the scale of the crisis was massive, with nearly 1 million learners that were displaced. So that's why I think what Creative was able to achieve and its partners was able to achieve holds a lot of promise for the field. Next slide, please. So just in terms of the program was launched in 2014 as a direct response to the education crisis that was brought forth by the Boko Haram insurgency. It was spread across 4 areas, which you can learn more about details, but the broad goal of the program was to provide quality education to displaced learners in 5 states. So what was the key tenet, the central premise of the program was to operationalize 2 community entities to provide education. Creative has had a long-standing presence in northern Nigeria. It's been around since 2004, and they already had sort of a community mobilization model in place that they were able to operationalize pretty quickly when they were awarded the program. So there was 2 streams of the program, of this community-led approach. The first was its partner NGOs. So through a competitive process, they selected 57 partner NGOs. These partner NGOs in turn formed community coalitions. These community coalitions were kind of like your boots on the ground. They were comprised of various diverse actors that formed the community. So it included your female leaders, union leaders, youth leaders, as well as your traditional leaders as well. These were the ones that, while the partner NGOs were responsible for directly overseeing the establishment of the centers, it was these community coalitions that provided sort of day-to-day input in terms of the locations of the centers, how they're going to be operationalized, recruiting the facilitators, as well as just sort of their day-to-day management. And this allowed Creative to be able to reach and establish centers in pretty hard to reach areas. Creative adopted a sort of a capacity building approach and through its program, throughout the program. There was 2 streams of activities. So it had a differentiated approach for its partner NGOs. It conducted a series of assessments, so kind of around organizational strengthening as well as financial management, and developed a 5-day training based on the results of that assessment. So this helped sort of build the management capacities of these NGOs that allow them to raise, secure over $1 million in their own independent funding. And the second stream of capacity building activities was focused on community coalitions. This was specifically around the community action cycle, as well as a sort of early warning and preparedness. So that would allow that would equip these community coalitions with the ability to sort of be able to respond to the needs of these learning centers during times of conflict. The results were quite impressive from a sort of an education emergency program. They were able to establish over 1,400 non-formal learning centers, reaching, over 80,000 learners. While the insecurity, unfortunately, has continued, which has sort of impacted the ability of community coalitions, but luckily, even through subsequent implementing partners, we see that these community groups are still in place and they're still keeping these centers running. So there's obviously a lot of sort of the important lessons learned that can be actually applied across different education and emergency contexts. So for more details, feel free to reach out to me directly or just refer to the paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Maryam. And I will turn it over to Susan Ayari.
Thank you so much, and thanks to my co-authors and co-contributors. I had hoped Hata Van Ginkel would be able to join us today, but she's not available. We wrote these notes because Afghanistan, like so many other places, is such an interesting place to work. And when the ministry came to us and said they wanted SEL to be an offering, but they didn't want an extra course added into the timetable, we were then challenged with integrating SEL into how to teach children to read in grades 1 through 3. And it was an exciting opportunity for us to support the theory out there coming from CASEL and other places that integrating SEL is probably one of the better approaches rather than having it be a standalone. We were able to demonstrate that SEL did harmonize with teaching children how to read. Repetitive activities would support brain building, and that was elevated into the teacher guides so that teachers saw how certain activities they were doing related to the various competencies. And literacy teachers or reading teachers became SEL teachers. And this supported what the ministry wanted was to ensure that classrooms moved closer to being safe learning spaces and healing spaces, given the context in Afghanistan. And all this was supported through coaching and teaching learning circles. Next slide, please. So what did we learn? Well, we learned that there was time to do it, that adding SEL into the curriculum didn't detract from helping children learn how to read. It wasn't adding more time into the school day, that parents and teachers recognized the benefits of the new curriculum, making comments like, this curriculum has created an unprecedented variety of children's taste that has strengthened their sense of well-being. Other focus group members said the minds of the children have become stronger, they're alert, more active than before. We found we could measure it in terms of how teachers were performing, integrating SEL observations, what was going on in the classroom when teachers were being observed by their supervisors. And of course, in teacher professional development, it really needed additional support in coaching and teacher learning circles because the 5-day training didn't offer enough of a focus on SEL. And that contextualization, when done well, and we think we did it pretty well in Afghanistan, can really help these materials be appreciated by governments and by the people using them. We were a little concerned that maybe the Western notion of SEL wouldn't have a place in Afghanistan, but it turned out that it did. It aligned some of the competencies aligned with Islamic principles of self-control, respect for others, helping others. And so this provided a great way to see how it lined up and inspired more research that we hope we'll be able to publish later. So despite the current realities in Afghanistan, these materials are still in use, and our hope is that they will continue to be in use further down the road. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan. And last but not least, I will turn it over to Dr. August Ting Mayai. August, are you there? Are you able to hear me?
Oh, yes. I can hear you. I just arrived at the hotel.
Okay.
If you can please give me.
How much?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Do you need
just 2 minutes? Yeah, I'm just gonna sit down right now. Just a minute or two.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
So in that case, so maybe we can open up the Q&A for a moment, and then we can jump back in with August when he's able to get started with his presentation.
Yeah, I'm gonna need to check in, but I have a thing to do here.
So questions from our panelists, questions from the audience, questions for each other. We have a quiet group of attendees today.
Well, I can start us off. I was curious to hear a little bit more about this tension that Daniel left us with at the end. Your one key takeaway, Daniel, that you said was really important for us to understand in terms of available data and the uses of data that's already available. And I really like the way you set forth your questions in your article to the juxtaposition between often describing the data we wish we had in education emergencies research versus what we really do already have, but aren't using in a particularly efficient way, or maybe it's hidden, or maybe it comes out among some actors, but it's not accessible to others. Could you describe a little bit more about that one key takeaway you mentioned at the end of your presentation?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thanks for the question and the opportunity. I think, when we started the work, this was kind of a part of a larger kind of effort, and there were some other publications that have and will come out related to it. And I think early on, part of the assumption is that there's not enough data, and of course there are really important data gaps. But what we found is actually there's quite a lot of data. It's just difficult to access, sometimes poorly organized, sometimes behind kind of organizational access walls due to privacy concerns, very legitimate concerns, but also sometimes due to a lack of structure to efficiently share. So I think one thing that we need to be perhaps careful of is there's a lot of data collection exercises going on in many of these communities by NGOs, by international orgs, by researchers, and finding a little bit better way to find synergies, use data, make data available. There's been a number of efforts to do this through OCHA. There's now at INE the data reference groups that are bringing folks together, making sure that efforts to kind of harmonize, synthesize, and share data are kind of not working at cross purposes. So I think, there are legitimate concerns sometimes around privacy and safety of individuals, but I think there are solutions to those concerns so that we can better use the data that we have. And also the way we design data collection so that it can serve other uses. So if it's designed in such a way to link up to other systems, or we know that, these schools are covered with this organization's data collection and not this other's, kind of like the 5 Ws for data in some ways. Then I think we could make much better use for policy and practice. So I don't know if that fully addresses your question, but I think just the short answer is we started out with the idea that there's not enough data, but what we came to is one of the big challenges is there's a lot of data that's very kind of hard to access and hard to use, but could be extremely useful for informing the work in this sector. And given the lack of funds that we all experience, I think that that's an important thing to think about how we do better.
Thank you so much.
August, are you ready to share your presentation?
I am ready.
Terrific.
I am.
Over to you,
Yes.
Augustino Ting Mayai.
Thank you so much, everyone. Apologies for this hiccup. I've been in transit since 9 o'clock. I thought I would be early enough to catch up with you guys. Nevertheless, let me get into the issues concerned with the paper. Number one is that this paper is motivated with 2 reasons. Reason number one is that, as we all know, war is bad for a number of reasons. Often people get injured, or even worse, get killed or get displaced. You have infrastructure that gets destroyed. You have basically disruption of economic activities. And a combination of all this culminates in socioeconomic problems that would be faced, whether in the short term or long term, by that particular society faced with that war. Item number 2 as a motivator is that with all this we know about the consequences of war, focus has been placed more generally on the aspect of humanitarian need. But not much attention has been paid to other issues that are caused by the war itself. And as we all know, focus is placed on individuals who are faced or caught in the conflict, their experiences, but little is paid to the institutions that would host, for example, children that are learning, teachers, and the institution of education as a whole. And so in our case, the interest was that there is need to understand the impact of conflict on human capital formation or accumulation by looking at institutions. In this case, we're looking at school. And so the study was set to explore the nexus between primary school enrollments. In this case, we're looking at institutions and the civil war in South Sudan. And the interest was that insights would be drawn to inform educational policy or education processes, especially when the war is ended. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide, please.
Are you looking for the findings and discussion slide, August?
Okay. Okay, it just came on.
Yeah, there's a bit of a delay. Sorry about that.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. So what did we find globally? And in this case, we're looking at South Sudan as our globe. On average, the schools that we have looked at lost 85 children, which constitute over 18% of total enrollment. But we also wanted to see if there would be a sex or gender difference in the impact of conflict. And we found that boys were significantly affected. And in this case, we're looking at a statistical difference between boys and girls in terms of attendance and enrollment. So then what have we learned from this analysis? Number one is that at the global level, we know that the war was bad in terms of human capital formation. But we also zero in and look at the sex difference and figure out what it is that differentiates the boys from girls. And we think that even though we know for a fact that boys are more affected, female children have for long been affected by other factors. And so as a result, you have a picture which says boys will be faced by war, they will drop out. That does not mean female children are benefiting in any way. It means that social cultural constructs, which have been in the way for a long time, actually prevent these girls from schooling. And so looking at this policy-wise is that when there's a conflict, we know for a fact that the community safety is going to be prioritized, and literally is done to save the schools or institutions that are providing educational services. And so in this case, we are providing a recommendation that says, focus on community safety, but also focus on those institutions, protect them from armed groups, occupying them, protect them from being destroyed. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, August, and thank you to all of our presenters. Such rich content, and I know we just gave you a preview of the terrific articles that are represented in the issue, but please check them out in their full glory in the most recent publication. So we do have some time for Q&A, and let's see, I think we've got one question that has come in. Okay, so requesting to, if you are able to, presenters, to share a link to, not to your presentation, sorry, for your articles. Yes, so Flavia, we will include those links in the chat. You can find the full publication on the journal website at iane.org/journal. Available free to download and read there. Other questions from attendees or from panelists?
There's one in the chat. I mean Q&A.
Oh, okay, great. Thanks, Dana. I was looking on the wrong panel inside the Q&A. So in places like South Sudan, how would you motivate the community, considering that the teachers are mostly volunteers and that they have not gone through initial teacher training? So how would you motivate the government institutions that support teachers? So I think that the question is directed to you, August.
Thank you very much. So the lack of educational support in South Sudan is a combination of a variety of factors. One of which is the lack of incentives for teachers to engage in education profession. And over the years, since the paper was published, so I wrote the paper in 2018, there has been a debate on how to improve educational processes in the country. Now that the peace agreement was signed, it was signed exactly the same year I produced the paper in 2018. And one of the things on the table is that if you don't motivate the teachers and increase their incentive, you will still have two problems. One is that more children will not get the opportunity to be educated because there will be fewer teachers. And second is that the teachers that are providing those educational services are not qualified enough. So two things have been put on the table. And in 2021, the government passed a resolution that increased the salaries of teachers. But also now there's a new program which increases support for technical training institutes and teachers training institutes. Both are meant to motivate interest in education, both from parents and also from the students. So those policies are now being put in place. I don't know if that answers the question.
Thank you so much, August. I don't see any other open questions in the Q&A. Oh, actually, maybe one just came in. Oh, okay, we do. So integration of SEL was done by including exercises as independent activities or breaks in a lesson or within the learning activities. So Elisar Yordanov, I'm not entirely sure who this question is directed to. I know there were a few presenters who discussed SEL. So maybe I'll turn it to our panelists if this question relates to your program. And oh, this is directed to Susan. So over to you, Susan. Thanks, Elisar.
Actually, it was within the learning activity. So, for example, exercises on the diacritics was related to brain building, or exercises in syllabication, again, trying to tie in the kinds of things about learning to read, but how that relates to SEL. The reading passages all were thematically based. So what it means to be a good friend, a good neighbor, how you help out at home, caring for your environment, and the kinds of questions that teachers were prompted to ask were also linked to the SEL competencies, but also asking open-ended questions was linked to SEL. And you know, in many of our environments, particularly with very large classes or teachers who don't have a lot of experience, classroom pedagogy is very didactic. It's kind of the pouring in method. And this opened up new opportunities and new ways for teachers to interact with their students. So it was all integrated in, but in the teacher guides, maybe made more overt why we were doing, or the teachers were being asked to do certain things to support the learning. Languages, the languages in Afghanistan were Dari and Pashto. Well, I mean, we believed it was effective when we saw how teachers improved over time through the observation protocols that we developed, and being able to see the kinds of comments and issues and topics that teachers were addressing in their teacher learning circles.
Thank you, Susan. I see a follow-up question for August. August, would you mind extending, the way this is phrased here, would you mind extending such motivation to ECD and post-secondary? So how does what you just shared relate to ECD and post-secondary?
So early childhood development, right? So that, as I understand. So what's so how do I relate the policy of improvement in education to this, or to war? It's not clear to me.
Sorry, I was on mute. The question is, would you mind extending such motivation to ECD and post-secondary? So does that clarify, or would you like further clarification from that?
So what am I extending an analysis into that, or it's still not clear to me? What am I extending?
Yeah, I think the question is are your findings relatable to ECD and post-secondary? And if not, then that's
so it's possible. I mean, the war would be expected to have affected the entire society. Unfortunately, we have not taken a look at that. I wouldn't be surprised to see similar results if an analysis was undertaken in this respect.
Thank you, August. Attendees, if you have further questions, please go ahead and populate them in the Q&A. I would love to pose a question. Oh, I see another one that's come in the chat. Have you done any further research since this paper came out in 2018? So this is for August, or are there plans? I'm curious if and how COVID has impacted the gender dynamics and other findings you presented.
Yeah, so similar response. The paper was written in 2018, long before the emergence of COVID-19. As you might have seen in the other countries where the analyses have been conducted, clearly young girls who were forced to stay home as a result of lack of schooling ended up getting pregnant. And in terms of looking at the long-term effect of that, there's a possibility in a place like South Sudan that they will never return to school. And that is something that I know for a fact has occurred in South Sudan, even though the analysis has not been conducted.
Thanks very much, August. And panelists, if you're able to turn on your videos, please do. So I'd like to ask a question across the panelists, and please respond if you'd like to. So what are the ways that your programs, your research, or the tools that you presented provided supports or addressed some of the most marginalized groups among the populations and in the context that you were looking at or that you were working in, or the data that you were looking at? So, girls or learners with disabilities or minority groups, those who are affected by the most extreme poverty. Were there ways that your programs or research addressed those groups?
In our work in Colombia, we found that women with children were the most marginalized in terms of accessing TVET. And that was because since they usually didn't have childcare and they lived in very unsafe neighborhoods, they were reluctant to commit to longer term educational programs and went into the entrepreneurship track instead. But as I mentioned in that track, they didn't have any opportunities to engage with other, non-combatant people, to do internships, that kind of thing. And they saw that as not a way to make money while still staying home with their children, but that really limited them in terms of the outcomes that they could achieve through their TVET programs.
Thank you, Stephanie. Kathryn, I think you had your hand up a moment ago.
Sure. From the JEiE research, we found from the survey that the area of inclusion and equity, especially for marginalized groups and children with disabilities, was an area that respondents felt was not adequately addressed in JEiE programs. However, from the scoping review, we found that the majority of organizations did have some information on inclusion and equity as part of their mandate, but the way that this manifested in programs was actually quite different. Some focused more on integrating contextualized cultural competencies into programs with young children and their caregivers. Others had specific programs focused on inclusion and children with disabilities. So the mandate was there, but the way that it translated to programs was different. And so we thought that this should be an area of further inquiry. And we're really happy and pleased to see that this is an area that INEE, specifically with the ECD task team, is taking up in a consultancy to do a specific landscape of this particular area moving forward.
Yeah, maybe I can just add a bit. I think something that we found, which is relevant to this, is we were testing out implementing Can't Wait to Learn with a whole range of implementing partners. So some were international NGOs, but some were community-based organizations. And actually through those organizations, despite the fact that they sometimes needed slightly additional support from War Child as an implementing partner, we found that they really increased our access to the most marginalized families within the community. So extremely low socioeconomic status, and very often communities outside of refugee camps, specifically in informal tented settlements. Thanks.
Thank you, Kathryn and Jasmine. Do any of the other panelists want to speak to this question?
I might just say, just from the data perspective, that it is the case that this is where you see like data gaps, particularly issues like learners with disabilities is a big gap in most contexts. Minority groups sometimes are difficult due to the politics around kind of how you slice and dice different groups and then whether people want to be identified or not. And then I would add that I think as a larger category, we probably need to do a bit better about how we identify and support returnees. Sometimes there's a bit more for refugees or for IDPs, and then people kind of fade, even though they need a lot of support when they return home.
In the case of Afghanistan, less around SEL, but the project itself, when we did our midline EGRA, we did find that rural schools and the community-based education providers, those students did not perform as well. And so we reinforced remedial and put together remedial programming to support children who appeared to come in with fewer advantages, as a hope that that would strengthen the program that we had already put in place. That didn't obviate the work we were trying to do in SEL, just help to support it. Unfortunately, so much happened during the time we were implementing COVID and political upheaval that we were unable to do an endline EGRA and to see really the effects of that added support.
Unmute myself. So I think one of the good things about the ECR program was that they had established differentiated learning centers. So I think because they were catering to like a pretty broad age range of learners, they had sort of segmented the learners based on ages, but within that, what they all had also separated out adolescent girls, which allowed them that to sort of target the curriculum a little bit more, and they'd infuse themes around gender-based violence. There was also specialized centers for learners with physical disabilities. Of course, there's debate now. I think that the field is sort of gradually moving away from like separate centers for learners with disabilities. But I think at that time when they started, they felt it was a good way to make sure that they weren't excluded from these, from this education provision. But yes, I think the differentiated learning programs definitely helped meet the targeted needs of these different groups, which included some marginalized groups such as adolescent girls and learners with disabilities.
Thank you all so much. I think there's a follow-up question to something that you said, Susan, in the chat. So the remedial, yeah, you see it?
Yeah, so the remedial targeted children, so we're just looking at where we were implementing the pilot, which was quite broad. And so those children had been receiving the SEL, but they weren't doing as well moving forward in their reading skills. So the remediation was around reading, and the remediation activities did include SEL. And I don't know if I can respond also to what Maryam said. One thing that was interesting about the ECR program was that we worked very closely with community-based organizations and national NGOs to be able to find ways to finance continued work in EIE without direct funding from ECR, from the USAID funds. And so they were trained on how to really put their elevator speech together, what it means to have a vision and mission, what was it they could offer in terms of supporting the EIE community, and then allowing them to really understand budgeting and applying for grants. This allowed them ways to continue some of those learning centers without USAID or ECR funding to find other funds. And that was moderately successful.
Thank you all so much for your thoughtful responses. I want to allow one final opportunity for any outstanding questions. And if there aren't any, then we can certainly wrap up a few minutes early. I know we've all got packed days ahead of us, or finishing long days, depending on where you're at.
I actually have a couple more questions.
Go ahead.
I'll take this opportunity since I don't see any in the chat. Stephanie, I was so impressed with you and your co-authors' work in Colombia among ex-combatants. And obviously this is an area that international organizations have focused on for a very long time, international and domestic, right? It's a crucial issue that countries emerging from conflict wrestle with, how to reintegrate ex-combatants. And this kind of disaffection from society that you're describing should be a serious concern. So what I'm wondering is really an extension of your work. what the discussion might have been around the ways in which these programs didn't really support women to the extent that presumably the program designers wished it would have, and if there were any new ideas that came from those conversations that you might be engaged in testing now, and or any recommendations from the people that you actually interviewed. And then another subset of questions is you said there were 12 women and 8 men in your interview group, but I assume, I know that in Colombia there are a lot of ex-women combatants, but I'm wondering the percentage, and sorry if I missed if you mentioned that. Thanks.
Sure, so I'll start at the end. So you're right that there are definitely more male ex-combatants than women. But in this study, we oversampled the women because we really wanted to make sure that we heard their voices and heard a diversity of women's voices. So that was a conscious decision to kind of flip the percentage in the study. One really practical thing that could have been done that would have really helped is just childcare. You know, childcare could have been provided for the ex-combatants either at SENA. SENA is the acronym of the government agency that was offering these TVET programs and that offers TVET more broadly, not only for ex-combatants. You know, if they could have done that for these women, provided them a safe place to leave their kids, that would have really, really helped. But it just seems to be something that wasn't really thought of because there's this perception that ex-combatants are men, right? You kind of have this idea that, you know, of an army and they're mostly male. But in Colombia, because of the long extent of the conflict there, some of the female ex-combatants had lived their whole lives with armed groups. Their parents had been in the armed group. They'd essentially grown up there, and now they're moving to the city for the first time. So these women don't have the social networks. You know, they don't have friends. They don't have cousins. You know, they've moved to the city from a rural area. And there was a lot of resistance to letting people know who you were, what your background was, or even letting your former, your former friends or, colleagues from the armed group know where you were. So even, those networks weren't useful because they didn't want anyone to know that they had been in an armed group because they moved specifically to create this new identity and cutting themselves off from whatever support that they had. So that's why it was particularly difficult for women. Men had, of course, more freedom to go around. The safety issues were less, certainly still an issue and something everyone talked about, but less serious for men than for women. Less social stigma for men being out, working on their small businesses or having a job outside the household or, leaving their kids at home with a partner. So in lots of ways, it was just more difficult for women and simple things really weren't, they just weren't front of mind, I think, for the program planners in the beginning.
Yeah, thank you so much. I have another question, Hetty, if there aren't any other questions from participants. Another quick question, I think. Actually, Kathryn had a question for Daniel.
I see a couple questions that have come in, and then I imagine there'll be time for yours as well, Dana. So I'll share Kathryn's question, which of course you're welcome to elaborate on if you like. So Kathryn in the chat says to Daniel that your research highlights one of the most significant challenges we found for elevating data and its use in the ECD-JEiE space. There's so much information out there, but required so much time to get this information. So maybe there's not actually a question here. It's just an exchange of information in terms of what you guys are finding and the challenges. Terrific. And Daniel, I don't know if you want to speak to that, or Kathryn, you're welcome to do so.
I'm glad the work resonates. I think, and also to flag the work of OCHA with the Humanitarian Data Exchange, I think that could be a good platform, but it has really spotty coverage as far as who shares and uploads there. So I don't think we need a new platform. I think we need better coordination about how, where, and how we share our data.
Agreed. Thank you so much for making this research available and finding these entry points for where information could live across the sector for all the levels of the system and the sector, including in children.
Yeah, well, thanks to all of you. It's all such deeply important research and evidence you're putting out there. I have another question that's come up for Susan. This attendee asks, perhaps this was already answered because it just disappeared from my list. Asking whether or not that EGRA information was published. I see you answered that question.
Most of the ACR work that was on the deck has been removed. We were asked to, for security reasons, not to leave the Afghanistan things on the deck. I would think maybe through GRN, because we had to submit a lot of things to them as well. I'm not sure. I know we have some USAID folks here, but I can share it if someone sends me an email. I can share the report.
Thank you, Susan. Dana, did you want to pose a last question, or shall I turn it over to you for some closing remarks?
I think I can wrap it up in the closing.
Sure.
We're ready.
Yeah, I believe so. I don't see any additional questions, so this would probably be a good time to turn it over to you to close us out for this discussion.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you, Hetty, and thank you so much, everybody. And thank you so much to all of our participants for joining us this morning or this afternoon or this evening, wherever you might be. This has been a true pleasure to work with all of you to get this issue published and presented. And there are so many exciting insights that we have in this volume. So I do hope everyone gets a chance to read through all of the articles. Also upcoming will be our podcasts with each of the authors who are featured in this issue. And I hope you can watch for those. Our podcast is called Behind the Pages. So let me just draw a couple of connections across papers and make a couple of final points that I heard come through, actually very pronounced in the presentations. I will be brief, but I just want to underscore a few important points. One is just this question about evidence that we've been talking about at the end, and the access to evidence and the problems accessing evidence. It really, as Daniel and Elizabeth and Annie, his co-authors, have pointed out, it's really a problem of clearly collaboration coordination. INEE is working towards collaboration coordination and gathering evidence and having the research and evidence group. So I think this will offer even more impetus for that group to move forward in very, very clear and concrete ways to open access to evidence that exists scattered across the internet, and also even perhaps in people's notebooks and file cabinets still today. I would also like to underscore Susan Ayari's point about Afghanistan, and that she mentioned the DEC. I'm not sure that everyone is familiar with that acronym, but what that stands for, excuse me, I'm getting a word called. What that stands for is the Data Experience Clearinghouse that has been run by USAID. Now, unbeknownst to probably many people, everyone who had decades of research on education in Afghanistan had to remove their research from public access because of concerns about security for folks who were part of carrying out those studies. And that has done a huge disservice, I think, not only to Afghanistan, but also to educators everywhere interested in all of the valuable information that came from communities in Afghanistan working to provide education over these so many years, the past 20 years of conflict and upheaval in Afghanistan. So I encourage folks, if they are interested in the studies, please do reach out to authors, including Susan, and of course, my own research, but also that hopefully will be available at a later date. Susan, I'm hopeful that that information will be once again available to the public. But I'd also like to underscore a couple of other key points that come out of the research that you see featured in this issue today. Augusto Mayai's work on South Sudan, which so importantly quantifies the actual effects of education on children's learning and access to school, and differentiates that between boys and girls, and then represents a bit further, breaks down a bit further what those differences are between conflict and social cultural norms. And finally, Maryam Jalani's work from Northern Nigeria, this critical importance of community mobilization in providing education at the local level to learners. This is an excellent, massive program that offers also hopefully avenues for future research. Reaching 80,000 learners across the region is a quite a large number for a community-based education program. And the emphasis on community and the way that's parsed in this project is terrific. And finally, I don't think I've mentioned every single article, but just some I asked questions of, let me also draw attention to Jasmine Turner and her co-authors and their work to present a proof of concept idea for accessing out-of-school youth in Lebanon. Really terrific work. And again, very compelling information to show us numbers of students who are able to access programs and those who are actually benefiting from these programs. And did I say finally already? I'll say finally one more time. This emphasis on disabilities and data, I think, is also really critical that it has emerged in our conversations. And the fact that actually quantifying those numbers, Grace's paper, which Grace and co-authors presented, the actual numbers of learners who couldn't access education or couldn't benefit from learning because of disabilities, quantifying those numbers, being able to say, this is how many is critically important for getting the funds to support those learners. So thank you all so much for presenting such valuable information. Kathryn Moore and co-authors also on ECD across the globe and available evidence and what practitioners and authors want. We're going to close here. Please feel free to reach out to us at the Journal on Education Emergencies, my partners at INEE, and of course, all the authors and co-authors who are here with us today presenting their excellent work. Thank you all so much for joining us. Hedy.
Thank you all so much. You can find a recording of this event and all the presentations on INEE's website. So thank you all for being here for a terrific panel. And thank you to our panelists for your terrific work. Bye, everyone.